Well, hello everybody. Welcome to another video on History By Podcast. And today I'm joined by Dr. Dom Crossan. And today's discussion is based upon his book titled Paul the Pharisee, A Vision Beyond the Violent Civilization. His book just recently came out. And I'll leave a History Valley Amazon affiliate link in the description below so you can go get his book. And so that being said, welcome back to the show, Dom.
Always a pleasure to be with you, Jacob.
Yeah, thank you for joining me. Can you tell the audience a little bit about what your new book is about before I get to my questions?
Let me just pick on that last word, Pharisee. Certainly, Pharisees get a very bad reputation, and I would claim a libelous reputation in the New Testament, because if you talk about the earliest Jews who were what I would call messianic or Christic, not Christian, Christianity hasn't been invented yet, but they're messianic Christic Jews, they're fighting for the center of their people with the Pharisees, who really have staked out the center with maybe the Essenes to the left and the Sadducees to the right. So I want to explore the very meaning of Pharisee beyond the libel, beyond the way we use Pharisaic as an insult or anything else. Paul was a Pharisee. He says it. Luke says it. I want to see what that means. And the book is sort of exploring that like you might the atom into all its conclusions and implications.
When you call him a Pharisee, there are some that would doubt that. Could he really have been a Pharisee? He doesn't seem to act like one. His views are so different from that of a regular, everyday Torah Orthodox Jew of his time.
Yeah.
How could he really be a Pharisee? It doesn't make sense to some people. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, it probably didn't make sense to a lot of his fellow Pharisees. That's why he was in such trouble. But also, by the way, the evidence of the New Testament is it didn't make much sense to his later Christians looking at him. They weren't quite sure about him. Maybe Peter was a safer bet. So Paul is a radical. My slogan over there about who's afraid of the big bad Paul, most of the New Testament, yeah, that's not just being funny. Luke spends an awful lot of time in the Acts of the Apostles de-radicalizing and re-Romanizing Paul. So yeah, I don't think he's a liar. I have no evidence for it, so I call nobody a liar unless I have clear evidence. I think he is absolutely sincere. He says he's a Pharisee. He doesn't say he's an ex-Pharisee. He never says anything like that. So I take him very seriously.
Can you talk about what you call the Roman matrix and the Jewish matrix?
Let me explain. I use the word matrix not just to be kind of difficult, but I found people very often when they talk about text and context, or foreground and background, somehow the background and the context disappears into the air somewhere. I want a single word, matrix, which means everything you got to know what's going on. Today in America, everything you got to know to understand the headline. Back in the first century, everything you have to understand to know what's a Pharisee. That's what I mean by matrix.
And before you finish, I just want to correct myself. I meant to ask the Christian matrix and Jewish matrix, but yes, question's the same.
Yes, I think historically we started in a way with what I call a Christian matrix, especially putting Paul back in the Reformation, and Paul against Judaism is kind of like Protestantism against Catholicism, and it's all great fun and mostly bunk and polemically useful, but not historically valid. So if you're keeping within that Christian matrix, you're going to see the Paul you want. You're going to see yourself. So we say Paul was a Jew. He himself insists he was always a Jew. Now he's a certain type of Jew. And in the first century, there were different types of Jews. That shouldn't, by the way, be news. There's always different types of everything, including Americans. So what type of a Jew was he? And that's what I'm pushing. The key word is to understand him as a Pharisee. But now, the Roman matrix. You can't talk about Judaism in the diaspora or the homeland in the first century as if the Romans weren't there and sort of arrived mysteriously at the last moment. This is Judaism under Romanization, under Roman power, responding to Roman power. So you have to take that Judaism, or that Paul the Jew, put him under Rome. What's his position on Rome? Is he for it? Is he against it? Is he neutral? Does he have anything to say about it, or does he just think it's irrelevant? The point of the book, though, is we have moved along those three matrices. I think right now, the consensus of scholarship is to understand Paul's Judaism, Paul the Jew, if you will, inside Roman imperialism. I'm pushing it to say, could we think in terms of big history, evolution? How does Paul look within human evolution? If, for example, somebody wasn't a Christian, wasn't a Jew, couldn't care less about God, Bible, or any of that, is Paul of any validity, or is he just something only of value, either to Jews who he may annoy, or the Christians whom he may also annoy? How does he look in the public square, as it were?
And what do you call the fourth matrix?
That's my term for evolution. Here's really I have to be personal here. In the first decades of this century, there was a Bart Crossan pilgrimage went every year to Turkey in the footsteps of Paul. And every year, obviously the people who came with us, 30 or 40 people, were interested in Paul, or they wouldn't be with us. But they were there in the last desperate attempt to see if Marcus and I could make some sense of Paul. They didn't like him, to be blunt. So I found myself being defensive, not only about Paul in the first century, before I even got to Paul in the 21st century. Hold on to that. Now, in the last couple of years, I read some European philosophers, the German philosopher Jacob Taubes, and the French philosopher Alain Badiou, the Georgia Agamben from Italy. And all of a sudden, philosophers who were not in the least bit interested in religion or Christianity, or Paul as an apostle maybe, and even defensively against him, kind of pleading, at least for Badiou. And all of a sudden, they're finding Paul relevant to the 21st century. So now, I'm finding my Christians over here that I take to Pauline sites are having trouble finding Paul of any redeeming social influence, let alone relevant. And I'm finding European philosophers. So that kind of came together to say, okay, let me take another look at Paul as if I was talking to infidels or atheists or agnostics or people for whom this isn't the matrix, to try and imagine the matrix as evolution. What does Paul, as a thinker, let's forget him as an apostle, as a thinker, like Plato, for example, does he have anything to say to us today within cosmic evolution, which we all know about? Whether we like it or not, we live in it. We can ignore it, but most of us accept gravity. Whether we're Catholic, Jewish, Hindu, anything, we kind of respect gravity, however we explain it. So that's the fourth matrix, is the evolutionary matrix. How does Paul look? If I'm going to be very blunt, if I could bracket atheism and theism for a moment and say, could we look at Paul from the lens of evolution, cosmic human evolution? How does he look?
What is Paul trying to do? And what is his goal? Like when he converts, claims to have this vision, and my second question to that is, do you see a conflict between Acts and the way it talks about his conversion story and what Paul in his letters tells us? And what does his goal become after he's converted?
Let me talk, first of all, about the easier part of your question. Is there a clash between, let's call it the Pauline Paul, that's the Paul of the 7 authentic letters, and the Paul of the Lucan Paul, the Pauline Paul, the Lucan Paul? Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Luke will give everything to Paul except what is most important. Was he an apostle on a par, say, with Peter and the rest? That is, he has seen the Lord. And therefore, of course, if he's not an apostle, he can't be an apostle of the Gentiles. Luke pretty much wipes that out. Now you say, wait a minute, he gives 3 full accounts of Paul's, of what happens at Damascus. Oh, it couldn't be more important. Yeah, but read it carefully. What you find is Paul is blinded by the light. When you're blinded by the light, you ain't seeing anything. Paul insists, I have seen the Lord. That makes me an apostle. Luke says, no, you haven't seen the Lord. You're a great missionary, terribly important, all the way to Rome. But you're a missionary. You're a second-class disciple. Peter and the 12 have seen the Lord. You haven't. Sorry. That wipes out Paul's authority, his integrity, his identity, gives him what he doesn't give a hoot about. Well, I shouldn't say that maybe, but it wipes out what he lives and dies for. I am an apostle because I've seen the Lord.
And what about Acts and what it talks about his conversion story? Does it give us more reliable information, or does it contradict what Paul says about the circumstances of his conversion?
Absolutely contradicts it. It gives us gorgeous theatrics. Look, nobody in the New Testament can tell a better story than Luke except Jesus. When Luke tells a story, we use the phrase today as a cliche, the Damascus experience, on the road to Damascus. Once Luke tells a story, it's almost impossible not to see it that way. Now, I don't mind Luke giving us this story on the road. It's a great metaphor. You're changing your mind and you're going from place to place and you're struck to the ground. It's a marvelous metaphor. The trouble is the content of the metaphor. Luke, as I said, is denying what Paul lives and dies for, his apostolicity. If everything else was the same, if Paul saw the Lord, but he not only doesn't see him, he doesn't even recognize his voice. Who are you, Lord? He doesn't even get it after they're speaking to one another. This is exactly the opposite to the apostles, who see the Lord not only during his earthly life, of course, but have visions of him after his ascension. So Paul is quietly negated. And furthermore, he's replaced by Peter. Peter is the one who in chapters 10 and 11 has the great revelation and becomes the apostle of the Gentiles. Doesn't get the title. His account of his conversion, if you will. And it's kind of a conversion because he almost argues with God. I don't eat that stuff. Don't you call stuff unclean? So you can almost see it. I mean, I kind of use a conversion there. I don't use that term for Paul so much. So if you're reading Acts carefully, and you shouldn't do the Bible unless you're reading carefully, look at everything that happens to Paul almost happens earlier to Peter. Peter is the apostle of the Gentiles, without the title granted, in Acts. There's even 3 accounts of it. When it happens in chapter 10, when he tells it in chapter 11, tells it again in chapter 15. And in chapter 15, James almost pays no attention to Paul and Barnabas, but he mentions what happened to Peter and lets Peter tell the story again. So it's not just like what happens on the road to Damascus. The Acts of the Apostles are a careful wipeout, denigration, to use a blunt term, of Paul, to be replaced by Peter.
What about when Acts tells us other things about Paul's encounters with like Sergius Paulus, John Mark, Elymas Bar Jesus? Is there any historicity to those narratives, or is there reason to doubt what the author of Acts is saying there as well?
Let me draw back before I reply to that, because there's a preliminary question that any scholar must face. Granted, there is a tension, let's use a neutral term, between the Pauline Paul and the Lucan Paul. How are you going to solve that, dear scholar? Before you begin, Are you simply going to use Luke like a buffet, like this? Take it, don't like that, leave it. Is it a cherry picking operation? How do you decide what to take or leave from Luke? Luke Acts, of course, I mean. Here's what I did in my own case. I took about a year to a year and a half. I forgot. I said, leave Paul aside. Let me focus on Luke, on Acts really mostly, but really on Luke Acts as a whole. Let me try and figure out what Luke Acts is up to. So before I answer any individual question, it's going to be based on that. What is the purpose, function, authorial intention of Luke Acts? Why, first of all, are there 2 volumes? So the first question I had to answer was, is this a book? And then years later, a sequel? Or is it a 2-volume book planned from the beginning like that? You mentioned, for example, Paul in Romans. I see the intention of Luke Acts to show Christians, I'm using that term now, Christians, because I'm thinking the beginning of the 2nd century, how they can be safe within the Roman Empire. It's safe to be a Christian in blood. In fact, the future belongs not to Jewish Christianity, says Luke, but to Roman Christianity. That's why Paul is heading inevitably westward, and the story ends when you get to Rome. Roman Christianity is the future. That's the theme of Luke Acts. That's why it takes, as it were, 2 big scrolls to do it, where Mark and Matthew and John can write in 1 scroll. So the first thing you have to do is, what's the theme? And that's the theme. The future holy city is Rome, not Jerusalem. And Paul would be screaming, by the way, to hear that. So would Matthew.
So when you look at Sergius Paulus, Limus Bar Jesus, Simon Magus, John Mark in Acts, do you put any stock in those narratives, or do you think Acts is conjuring up more stories about fictitious encounters that did not exactly occur?
I think the way Luke operates is he has excellent Pauline information, but he gives it a Lucan, I'm going to use this term, misinterpretation. Let me use a classic example, and I'll get back to the ones you mentioned. Paul tells us of his exit strategy from Damascus, over the wall in the basket. It's unforgettable. Luke has it too. Luke says he did it because the Jews were trying to kill him guarding the gates. Paul says because the Nabateans were trying to arrest him guarding the gates. I go with Paul there. But watch, the event is true. Paul, I think, did come up. It's a great story, but I think it's true. Paul was let out of Damascus through a window in the wall. He ran, in plain language. He fled. I think that happened. Yes, that's an historical event. Now, if you ask who's after him and why is somebody after him, Paul makes absolute sense to me. Aretas IV has just thrust north from Petra and is probably kind of take over Damascus. Paul, as a Jew in an Arab country, is in trouble. That makes sense to me. I will take that as historical, as best we can get. The Jews guarding the gates of an Arab city in the 1st century in Damascus to kill Paul? No. That's Lucan thematics, anti-Jewish thematics. So be very careful when you're reading Luke Acts about the Jews. So come back to your example. Do I think Sergius Paulus was the proconsul at Paphos of Cyprus? Yeah, sure. We even got some indirect, granted, evidence for it. Sure. Did Paul meet him? Now I'm getting a little bit questionable, but okay, for the moment, nothing happened. When you read the story, you think, well, did Paul convert him? Or did he simply prefer Paul's version of things to his other resident magician, as it were? Did he think Paul and the other barriers, as you might say, were just, kind of entertainment, court entertainment not quite court jesters, but court philosophers, if you will. It's plausible. I don't know at that point, but when I read Luke, what I see is the very first authoritative Roman official Paul runs into. He either converts him, which is probably pushing it, I doubt if that's true, but they get on fine. So Paul's all set for Gallio at Corinth, all the way to the end of the book. Every single Roman official who runs into Paul says he's innocent. I do not know anyone who's ever been so innocent. But of course, if I'm a Roman, I'm going to say, I wish he wasn't up before us so often. If he was that innocent, why is he ever up in court all the time? So Luke's apologetics, and it is apologetics, is the Jews are causing trouble all the time. Everywhere you look, the Jews are rioting. The Romans keep saying that Paul is innocent, at least from a Roman point of view. That is the apologetics of Luke Acts at the beginning of the 2nd century. Does it have an historical core? Of course. Is it an historical novel? No, because too much of the history has also changed. It's not that he just keeps his history straight and over here invents a character. No, he has Paul meet Gallio or Sergius Paulus, like you said, or Festus, and they all say he's innocent. And no, that didn't happen. I don't think that happened. If every Roman official finds Paul innocent, what's he doing at the end on a boat going to Rome? You don't send innocent people to the imperial court in Rome, A, because it's too expensive, B, because they're going to ask you, what's the indictment? You're going to say, well, he's innocent, so I just sent him on. That's how to become an ex-Roman governor real fast.
What do you think Paul did when he was at Damascus that caught the attention of King Aretas IV and upset him subsequently into wanting him in custody?
First of all, I think it's quite plausible, as Luke says, we only have his evidence for it, that Paul was born in Tarsus. I do not think that that Paul was educated, as Luke says he was, in Damascus, in Jerusalem, sorry, because he says when he went to Jerusalem, nobody knew him there. He went there after his, let's call it his conversion or his revelation. I think he went to Damascus. I think he studied in Damascus. He was in Damascus. I think of him as sort of like the Orthodox enforcer in one of the Damascus synagogues. That's what he was doing, I think. So he is in Damascus. Now, forget Paul for a minute. Think of the two sides of the Jordan, the 1st century. On the west, you have it divided up, as we know so well, between the Herodian princes, Archelaus, Philip, and Antipas. We know that. Over on the other side of the Jordan, the Nabateans now have a powerful king, Aretas IV. Probably, well, you might have debate whether Aretas III, who conquered Damascus, might be greater, but he's as good as they've got in 100 years. And the best they're going to have for 40 years. He's going to be a long, long ruler. His hope plan is to thrust north. He wants to get Damascus, like Aretas III did, and printed and had coins made there. When's his chance? Philip, the Tetrarch, who claimed, as you remember, the northwest quadrant beyond, east of the Sea of Galilee, died 34, I think. Aretas makes his move. He pushes north. We know from Josephus that he was fighting with Antipas around Gamla. Wow, that's way, way far north. He's almost at Damascus. What's he doing in Gamla? I think the only thing that makes sense of him, he's grabbing Philip's territories and pushing for Damascus. Probably hopes the Romans will allow him to be a buffer state on a Damascus-Petra axis between them and the Parthians. Besides, Tiberius is just about dying, so maybe he'll get away with it. It all makes historical sense. Now, This is a time when Paul is a missionary among the Nabateans, a Jewish missionary in the wrong place at the wrong time for the wrong reason. Aretas is coming north. Maybe Paul has been using Damascus. So now he's trapped. He has to get out of it. It's not a good time to be a high-profile Jew in an Arab country, the Nabateans. All of that, at least, is absolutely historically plausible. Even if you were making it up, at least it would be a good historical novel. In other words, the history is right, in a way that the history is not right when the Jews are guarding the gates. So Luke is more apologetical history than an historical novel. He's not interested in, he's interested in apologetics at the beginning of the 2nd century, when we're just beginning to get philosophical apologetics like Justin Martyr. Now we're getting a brilliant narrative apologetics. Wow, over against the Roman story, you guys are followers of a crucified rebel, comes this perfect storm of innocence. Wow, if I was a Roman, I don't think I'd swallow it, by the way, but I'd read it and I would recognize that they're claiming us guys are really, really good guys. Jews are causing trouble. Romans find us innocent. It's magnificent apologetics. It just is not history.
So how does Paul view Jesus?
This is the core question. And to understand Paul, let me just imagine, trying to put myself in the mind of Paul for a moment. I don't know what verb. Okay, let me put it this way. We know that Paul says in 2 Corinthians that one time he had an ecstatic vision in which he was taken up to heaven, remember? And he doesn't even know whether he was in the flesh or out of the flesh. Ecstasis, that's typical ecstasy. And he said he saw things that he can't even tell. Now, hold on to that. There's one other time Paul talks about the mystery of God, using the term mystery, and says it's an eternal mystery beyond human understanding. I'm going to put those two things together. Here's what astounds, amazes, empowers, any verb you want, Paul. God knew, again, we can choose our verb, whatever we want. God knew, God allowed, God decreed, God, that when the Messiah came to earth, or use Paul line, when God sent the Messiah, when God sent the Messiah to earth, he would be executed publicly, legally, officially, by the greatest empire there ever was, which boasted of its law and order and civilization. That's the heart of Paul. How is that possible? What was God up to? Couldn't God have sent the Messiah a little bit some other time? Why did God, Paul's language would be decree. Why did God do that? And Paul's answer is God wanted to reveal to the world the savage heart of civilization, not just of Rome. As Paul says, the rulers of this world, the archontes, the rulers of this world didn't know what was going on, or else they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. Their vacuity, their poverty, their hypocrisy, their savagery was revealed in this. The Messiah came and they executed him. Now, that's the heart of Paul. In one sense, that's what he's trying to probe. That's what God, that's the mystery he calls the mystery of God. That's at the beginning of 1 Corinthians when he talks about this eternal wisdom of God, which contradicts the wisdom of normalcy. And we call it the stupidity of God, and God calls us the because they can't see that the execution. I'm emphasizing that the public legal execution. He wasn't lynched. He wasn't run over by a chariot, runaway chariot. He was not lynched. He was officially executed. That means that either Jesus was guilty, or Rome, which is simply civilization in a toga, is being revealed as bankrupt. That's where Paul starts. And in one sense, that's where he finishes, because then the next question is, okay, granted that we have revealed the core failure of civilization, what else must God reveal? Of course, the resurrection, which raises the issue, is there justice in the world then?
Can you tell us about Philo's view of a new creation that he talks about in his Life of Moses and how that parallels Paul's vision of a new creation?
Yeah, when we read the opening overture, I would call it, of the Bible, we call it Genesis 1. We find that God creates rest and all the rest of the Sabbath rest. We tend to kind of, oh, that's nice, you all get a rest. Now, Philo, however, interprets that rest as freedom. He says on the Sabbath, and then the Sabbath year and the Sabbath Jubilee, and all of time being regulated by the Sabbath, which otherwise you wouldn't have time in the Jewish sense, years, dates, is about freedom. It's an extraordinary comment. You are free from work. You are free from work. So is your draft animal. So are your draft animals. So are your children. So are your slaves and your servants. But so are the fields and the trees. And Philo says every blade of grass is free because you can't cut it. So what Philo sees as being created with the Sabbath is not just a day off or something like that, but that freedom inundates or inspirates the whole world. The rhythm of time runs to the rhythm of freedom. So that's the view of creation, which you get from a Sabbath view of creation. The very time itself is regulated to the rhythm of justice, of freedom. Paul talks about creation having to be restored in Romans. The creation is groaning. And of course, to be honest with you, the ones that make it groan, sometimes creation makes us groan with typhoons, I suppose, and tornadoes and volcanoes. But most of the time, as Paul sees it, we're making creation groan. What we do to creation. Now, Paul is not even imagining what we were talking about, climate change and all the rest of that. That's not even on the horizon. He's thinking of what war, especially, what violence does to the world. But that's how I would find Paul relevant today, because he's talking in a way about cosmic justice. And that's what we're talking about today. Not just about weapons of mass destruction, but the danger of losing biodiversity, and of course, accelerated, I would emphasize accelerated climate change, which is kind of what we're doing to the world. Paul doesn't see all of that. He just sees the first stage, weapons of mass destruction. It's already there, of course, in Isaiah, when you're beating your swords into plowshares, that they knew about that too.
Can you tell us a bit about Galatians 4:3-7 and Romans 8:14-17? What is noteworthy about those two passages?
What's worthy especially about them for me is that Paul is kind of stuck culturally, and he seems to know it. And we are stuck with the translation. In the patriarchal world in which Paul lives, the firstborn son, or the beloved son, or simply the son, is the heir. Now, that's the way it is. It's a sonship is heirship. So you can go to the New Testament afterward. Every time you find the word son, for Jesus as Son of God. Cross out son and put in heir, H-E-I-R. Paul is trying to talk about we are all, this is the extraordinary thing, sons of God. That gets us really annoyed when we're trying to think in terms of female as well as male. So very often we change it to we're all children of God. And that's nice in one sense. But it loses the cultural power. And there's sometimes not in Galatians, but in Romans, Paul will shift from saying we are all sons of God, talking about divine sonship, to divine heirship, using paideia, not huios. Here's what's at stake. In Paul's world, the son was the heir. So if he wants to tell a whole group of people, half of whom are women and half of whom are men, you're all heirs of God, he's liable to say you're all sons of God. It's the only way he can get it across. Now, he seems to be aware of the problem, because in Romans, when he's saying the same thing, he shifts from using the Greek word for son, which is huios, to the Greek word for child, which is paideon, after he has established, of course, that you are heirs. Because to say you're all children of God is very nice, but it's not as powerful as saying you're heirs of God and co-heirs with Christ. That is, I think, most extraordinary thing Paul says to his recipients of his life. You're co-heirs, not sub-heirs or para-heirs or whatever. You're co-heirs with Christ. So be aware not only of the linguistic problem, but of the cultural problem.
What led Paul to conclude that we need to go to the Gentiles?
Let me get back to resurrection. The Pharisees, let me back up a little bit. In the first century, there was a clear distinction, which we have lost, between ascension, apotheosis in Greek, and resurrection, which is anastasis in Greek. Apotheosis meant that a great individual like Moses within Judaism or Romulus within Rome could be on death taken up to God or the gods. They'd be taken up to heaven. Now, it's very individual. It's about individuals. It's personal. The Pharisees came up with these extraordinary ideas. The heirs, the ancestors of the Pharisees came up with it around the year 150 BCE. There is such a thing as cosmic justice. This is they're speaking to a world in which people are beginning, the Jews especially, is there any cosmic justice? Okay, it's fine to talk about the justice of God. We had the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Medes, the Persians, the Greeks. Now we got the Romans coming. Where's the justice of God? Empires are getting more powerful. Don't tell me about the justice of God when I can't see it anywhere. So the Pharisees insisted there will be justice at the end of time. Yes. Well, at least let's listen to them. There will be justice because at the end of time, every single person that ever lived is going to have to be brought back to life. You're kind of still scratching your head listening. And they will be judged. And there will be a heaven or a hell. Now, that may sound like, come on, you got to be kidding. But supposing you have an empire's boot on your neck and had it there for 500 years, the very idea that there might be justice somewhere in the world, that there might be justice, and maybe it might even be soon, we hope. This is the great Pharisaic vision. There is cosmic justice. Now, we might mock it, say, come on, everyone's coming back to life. What about cannonballs and all the rest of it? Yeah, it's great fun. But it raises the issue which we have to face today. Is there cosmic justice? What if we are going against evolution? Let me leave out divine punishments and everything else and talk about human consequences. What if we are doing stuff in the world that not that we'll be punished by God for at the end of time, but that we are having consequences every day already? That maybe heaven and hell are not places in the future, but locations in the present. And we're busy populating them as fast as we can. So Paul's Pharisaic vision of a cosmic justice, which for him is at the end of time, which, by the way, for Paul is coming soon, so it's possible to take it very seriously for him. What have we shifted from divine punishments to human consequences? From resurrection to responsibility, from judgment to accountability. Then it starts to look like the evening news. So that's the relevant challenge of Paul that these philosophers are beginning to see. That's my way of putting it. They mightn't agree with that relevance, but I'm beginning to see if for the moment we speak not of theism or atheism or argue about God, but say, okay, come down to the level of evolution. If you think God exists in classical theism, then that God operates by evolution, whether you like it or not. If you don't think such a God exists, fine, you still have evolution. You still have evolution. The death of God did not excuse us from gravity, for example. And gravity is the glue of the universe, not just what you and I have to think about when we're going down the stairs. So I want to see, back to my fourth matrix, evolution. What if we began to see Paul, for example, or Jesus, of course, but Paul for the moment, in terms of an evolutionary viewpoint? Because remember, Paul says that the resurrection has begun with Jesus. As a Pharisee, he believed in this general resurrection at the end of time. Then as a messianic Christic Pharisee, 1 Corinthians 15, say 20, he argues that the general resurrection, the Jesus resurrection, stand or fall together. He can't imagine as a Pharisee that resurrection is some special privilege for Jesus. You could imagine an ascension as a special privilege for Jesus. But that the general resurrection has already begun, whether you believe it or not, I'm asking, what on earth does that mean? Even for Paul to say it. It's like if you and I were to declare today, peace on earth has begun. Our response is, well, could I see exactly where it is showing up? Because I can't quite see it. So Paul is claiming that the cosmic justification, to use my language, of the world is already in process. That's what he means by the resurrection of Jesus. That the other side of the revelation of civilization's hypocrisy, if you will, by killing Jesus, is that God has also revealed that Jesus is resurrected, not just ascended. Paul would not accept simply that Jesus has ascended to God, just like Caesar did to the gods, or even the Caesar didn't and Jesus did. His word is resurrection, and that's a Pharisaic term. Not even a Jewish term, it's a Jewish Pharisaic term. And if you brought it up and tried to explain it to Romans, as Paul did according to Luke at Athens, they would just giggle. They'd just laugh at you. If you said Jesus had ascended, they might get into an argument with you. But if you brought up this resurrection, they would just roll over laughing. So to try and take seriously Paul the Pharisee and the Pharisaic concept of resurrection, and see how it was for Paul as a messianic Pharisee, and its relevance now, if it is, that's what the book is about.
And in my closing question, where did Paul get the idea that Jesus was going to come back? And where did he get the idea that it would be soon? What gave him that indication it would be anytime soon?
I think it honestly was inevitable. I mean, he's coming up with an idea so radical that to tell people, he had to kind of believe it. 2,000 years, if Paul's message was this is going to last, get ready for the long haul, it's going to last 2,000 years, I think Paul would have said, oh my, I quit. I quit. It's almost like, if you and I confronted with COVID said, well, get ready for it. It's a 2,000 years thing. It'll be here for 2,000 years. At least we held on to it would be soon. And so we were able to survive it. I think that's the same thing. The Jewish tradition have been saying for hundreds of years, God's great justification of the world is coming soon. The prophets have been saying soon, 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 soon. Now you got Jesus saying this strange announcement, it's here. And Paul saying the same thing. It's already here. I mean, the first reaction to that, honestly, would have been, you guys are nuts. I mean, we've known from all the time that when the Messiah comes, when the Messianic age is here, there'll be peace and everything. Where is it? And the message you're getting from Jesus and Paul is, it's starting only insofar as you people are starting it. Most people are, wait a minute, God's supposed to do it for us. Where does it say in the tradition that we're supposed to do it with God? Come on. We're waiting for God. We're praying for God. We're hoping for God. Only God can do it. You guys are saying we're in it too with God? And you're kind of saying if we don't do it, it won't going to happen? And Paul and Jesus would be in their heads. And now, for them, they can't imagine it. They simply cannot imagine it. Probably Jesus cannot either if you poke them about it. Is it going to happen within our lifetime? Sure. Is it going to happen in your lifetime, Paul? Well, maybe not mine, but certainly ours. I think that's where they get it. Now, the one interesting thing, though, is when Paul describes that consummation, it's a great big party. It's a parousia. Jesus comes in like the emperor comes in to your city for a great big feast, celebration. That's not the picture you get in the book of Revelation, by the way. So even if you're imagining the consummation, and even if you're imagining it as soon, and you're wrong by 2,000 years, it is important whether you're imagining it as a celebration or a cosmic punishment. So Paul does imagine it coming soon, but his word, and only his word, John doesn't use it in Revelation, is parousia. And apanthesis is what you do. Those are the words of celebration when the emperor comes to visit your city and you're having a great big bash, meat for everyone, festival, good time. It's a celebration. So, no, he was wrong, off by 2,000 years. That was coming soon. So was Jesus, if we can know what Jesus said as distinct from what was put in his lips. But if he did, he was wrong too. Everyone so far has been wrong, except there are people out there now who are talking about climate change and soon. And I'm not sure they're wrong, though I'm not sure that we are capable, to be honest with you, of destroying ourselves, but we're certainly capable of trying.
Can you briefly introduce the audience to what your new book is about? I mean, obviously it's about Paul, but can you tell us more about it?
Yes. People talk about the new Paul, understanding Paul as a Jew. I would add as a messianic Christique. I'm not saying Christian, because that means a separation between Judaism and this other, eventually, religion. Pharisee. What exactly does a Pharisee mean? That's the heart of the book. If you explore that all the way down to the depths, you got the book. Obviously, the Pharisees have I would call it a libelous description in the New Testament. They're kind of nitpicking legalists, hypocrites, in fact. This is part of the infighting between two groups fighting for the center, Messianic, Christic Jews and Pharisaic Jews. So could we scratch all of that? Dismiss it the way you would if you're listening to two candidates lacerating one another in public television or something. Go to Josephus. If you want to understand what Pharisees are about, bracket the New Testament, go to Josephus. What you find basically is they're very faithful traditionalists. And that's kind of ironic because the other major thing he tells you about them is they have this magnificent theory, which we're going to have to explore, about the resurrection. And of course, if I was a Sadducee, the first thing I would tell them is there ain't no tradition about the resurrection. If you're traditionalists, where did you get it? Show me that in the Old Testament, the Torah, the prophets, the wisdom. And they'll have to come up with some explanation that, oh, it's oral tradition. It's handed down orally. But the heart of a Pharisee is this belief in the resurrection. And I would ask the audience not to presume they know what that means, because what we're going to do is go into the first century and find out what it means. Then you can dislike it or like it or discard it or reject it. But you can't do that till you know what they're talking about. So a major question in the book is, when a Pharisee in the first century, or Paul, get it him, said resurrection, what did they mean before Jesus ever arrived on the scene?
So I'd like to take us to the beginning of the situation. So when Paul was persecuting Christians, was he persecuting them on his own, or did he have help from authorities? Who was he working for specifically?
All right, now we're touching here on whether we can use Luke Acts on Paul. And Luke Acts has excellent information on Paul and bad interpretation of Paul. Not by mistake, by the way. Luke knows exactly what he's doing and doing it brilliantly. He's preparing the long road to Constantine. That's what he's actually doing. So you'd have to be very careful with what you use from Luke Acts about Paul. For example, in Luke Acts, Paul is a sort of a mega persecutor. He starts in Jerusalem before he ever gets to Damascus, by the way. He's already persecuting in Jerusalem under authority from the high priest. So he's a big shot persecutor. The trouble is that Paul himself tells us in Galatians that when he first went to Jerusalem, none of these people he was supposed to have persecuted knew him. Now, you really do know your persecutor. That's the one person you know. So Paul's story, as far as I'm concerned, Paul's story, not Luke's story about Paul, begins in Damascus. I think he was probably, Luke got it right, I think, at least I have no reason to doubt it, born in Tarsus, and I think he went, shall I say, for graduate education to Damascus, not to Jerusalem. For Luke, everything begins in Jerusalem and goes out from Jerusalem westward. So he was a persecutor. I think of him as something like orthodoxy enforcer in the synagogue of Damascus. Maybe that's his own job, as it were. I've no reason to think that he's credentialed to do it, but he probably was ultra-conservative and didn't like any new ideas coming in about maybe this weirdo Jesus who was somehow the Messiah. These are the people he was persecuting, fellow Jews in the synagogue at Damascus who claimed that Jesus was, in anglicized Hebrew or Aramaic, the Messiah, anglicized Greek, the Christ, of course. That was what he was persecuting. He was persecuting, without a doubt. He says so, and on that Luke agrees.
Does the circumstances of Paul fleeing from Damascus in Acts, does it contradict 2 Corinthians when 2 Corinthians says that Paul fled from King Aretas, whereas in Acts he seems to be fleeing from other Jews that want him dead?
Thank you for that, Jacob, because this is where we can see it. I rest my whole case in the court of law on this, because it corroborates what I've said. Luke knows about the exit, the exit strategy from Damascus over the walls, because the gates are guarded. Now, Paul says he went out because the Nabateans under that's King Aretas IV, with his capital down at Petra, was guarding the gates to arrest him. All right, that's one thing. Luke says the Jews, quotation marks, the Jews were guarding the gates to kill him. Now, no, in the first centuries, first of all, the Jews didn't guard the gates of Arab cities. No, that's unhistorical. And the idea that somehow the high priest in Jerusalem had power to go all the way to Damascus in a different Roman area and use rendition, as it were, and brings people back. That's not even good history. That's pure fiction to make Paul, as I said, the super persecutor. So Paul tells us, and it makes sense because we know that Aretas IV was a great king, by the way, for the Nabateans, ruled until about the year 40 or so. And he's really pushing the power of the Nabateans north towards Damascus. I think that's what he's after. Aretas III had held Damascus, so the Nabateans are on the march, moving north to take Damascus. If Paul is a Jew, as he is, and he's working in Nabatea, he calls it Arabia, which is fine. He's working in Arabian Nabatea. He's in trouble. He's the wrong person, wrong time, wrong place, wrong purpose. So yeah, he's fleeing. All of that makes absolutely good historical sense. Luke does not make good historical sense, but a good polemical sense, because it's the Jews who are always causing trouble, not us people. The Jews are causing trouble. See, they tried to kill Paul. It's part of Luke's polemic, going all the way back to Luke chapter 4 in the Gospel, that the problem is not the Christians, but the Jews.
Now let's get to the circumstances of Paul's apparent conversion. What do you think caused it, besides his claim that he supposedly had a vision of the risen Christ? Did he feel guilty about persecuting the Christians? What was going on in Paul's mind?
The one thing I can't find anywhere in Paul is a hint of guilt. He's the most self-confident person I know. When he talks about in Romans about, oh, the weak person that I am, he's not talking about himself. He's imagining the human race. He's personifying the human race. Paul is about the most self-confident, and I'm not using that as a criticism, the self-confident writer. I think he's far more confident than Augustine is, for example. Augustine is plagued by guilt and foisted on the whole of Christian tradition. I don't get that in Paul. I don't get it at all. He persecuted, and I think it was his role as a Pharisee that assisted him to make the pivot from being a anti-Messianic Christic Jew to becoming a pro-Messianic Christic Jew. Because he could have converted to minding his own business. He could have converted to speaking to Jews. He goes the full, I don't know if it's 180% from the persecutor to the supporter, the persecutor to the promoter. So how is that possible without a psychic break? I mean, you can say revelation, and I have no doubt about it, he had a visionary, but even visions have to be distinguished from psychotic breaks. You could have a vision and go straight into a mental institution. So how is he able to shift? I think the core thing is that he was a Pharisee. He believed in the resurrection at the end of time. That's the great contribution from the Pharisees, that the world was ruled by cosmic justice, that at the end of time there would be a great reckoning on every one of the human race. And I'm not taking this literally, but I'm taking it very seriously. Every single person in the whole human race would rise up and be judged and go to heaven or hell. Now, taken literally, I think that's bunk. But taken metaphorically, I think it's lethally correct. Every human being who has ever lived, including you and I, are responsible for the state of the world and the creation of heaven and hell within it, and possibly for the fact that hell is winning. So when Paul says that this vision of cosmic justice has begun with Jesus, with the resurrection, he's using a Pharisaic vision and applying it to Jesus. That's the pivot. Because when he first heard about Jesus as the Messiah, that must have meant to him, well, if the Messiah is here, the Messianic age has begun, we thought that meant the general resurrection. Where is that evident? And then Paul's great revelation. I think you have it in a blinding ecstasy if you want, but even a blinding ecstasy has to have a content, is that resurrection has already begun. The process of heaven and hell is already operational within human time. That's a heck of a revelation. And quite frankly, I think it is correct. And that has nothing to do with religion or Christianity or Paul is an apostle. I'm just hearing him as an ancient thinker with a vision of the world that seems to me to be absolutely correct if I just look at the evening news.
When Paul converted to the faith, did he have the same views of Jesus as many others around him did, or were his views different from them?
I think his views are far more radical, honestly. I've used the slogan, you remember the last time we talked about who's afraid of the big bad Paul, and we said most of the New Testament, and that's not a crack, that's accurate. Luke Acts is a huge, I don't know if I want to use the word whitewash, almost an obliteration. Whitewash is too gentle, of Paul as the apostle to the Gentiles. Paul is much too radical for him. What he wants to do is tone Paul down and in his place elevate Peter. Because if you read the Acts of the Apostles, for example, everything that happens to Paul happens first to Peter. Paul, for example, is miraculously freed from prison. Yeah, but Peter was earlier. Paul raises somebody from the dead. Peter had done it already. And the three great depictions of the conversion of Paul to become apostle of the Gentiles are already given to Peter in Acts 10 and 11 and 15. So the whole, I don't know what term even to use, the whole disguising of Paul in the Acts is both to put him in his place under Peter, who is not nearly as radical, possibly because he never wrote anything. Actually, he obviously two epistles are attributed to him. So the New Testament's job, in a way, is to de-radicalize Paul and sort of re-Romanize him for tolerant Roman consumption. And that continues outside the New Testament in all those scenes that we know from early Christianity, as early as the first century, where you have Peter embracing Paul. They're embracing one another, but sort of, if you look closely, it's always Peter's arms that are around Paul. Peter is accepting Paul. And we have that in the famous Christian belt buckle found at Stabia, therefore dates before 79 of the first century, because that's under Vesuvius's lava. So there was a huge problem in toning Paul down. In the letters, of course, they're written in his name, but were not done by him, but especially in Luke Acts. Luke Acts is the main one who tones Paul down, makes him safe for Christian consumption.
But on the other hand, does Acts seem to exaggerate, or does it also tone down his persecutions?
There's a tone down Paul's persecution. I don't think it does, Jacob, because it starts in Jerusalem, which is an extension of them. We have no evidence whatsoever he was ever in Jerusalem persecuting. He goes to Damascus, as you know, under authority from the high priests, with the right to take dissident Jews all the way back to Jerusalem for punishment. So I think it vastly expands geographically, at least, the persecuting power of Paul. And of course, that's totally imaginary for the persecuting power of the high priests. I mean, a lynching is always possible, but Rome did not allow the high priest to exercise power like that at all, not even to exercise lethal power. The one time it was done killing James the Just, The high priest was pitched out of office for it. Rome had a monopoly on executions in the first century.
So, what was Paul's exact views of Jesus, and how did they differ from the others that he argued with, like with Peter, James, and others, etc.?
Okay, there's a term that Paul uses in Romans and again in Corinthians, which really is the crucial to his core. He talks about the mystery of God. He talks about the mystery that was hidden from all eternity in the mind of God and is finally revealed. And most people don't spend enough attention on, well, that must be big. What's he talking about? And the clue is, he says in Corinthians that the mystery is now revealed, but none of the rulers of this world understood it, because if they had, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. Now, here's how I interpret that. And we have to interpret it. It's there. What strikes Paul's imagination is, how is it possible that God, now I'm being careful about the verb, I'm going along with Paul's anthropomorphic vision of God, that God knew, that God allowed, that God decreed, that God decided that when the Messiah came, he would be executed. That stuns Paul. Why did God time it, since God can do whatever God wants? Why did God send, I'm going to use a verb he would have no problem using, send the Messiah in Jesus of Nazareth to be executed by the Roman Empire, the greatest empire the world has ever known, the one that boasts about its law and its order and its peace and its civilization? And this is Paul's great understanding. And it's rock bottom core in Paul. It's the heart of Paul. God thereby revealed the savage heart of civilization. Oh, so Roman law, Roman justice, all this stuff about Roman civilization, bringing civilization to the Germans in their forests and the Irish in their bogs. Well, they didn't quite do that to either of them. But anyway, bringing civilization, executed the Messiah. Now, maybe you and I can say, well, that's, things happen. That stunned Paul, because he had to ask himself, what was God up to? And what Paul understood is given away in that statement that the rulers of the world did not understand this because they wouldn't have crucified. It revealed their own hypocrisy, their own vacuity, their own emptiness, that the vaunted boasts of civilization are shown by this execution for Paul. Now, it's the execution of the Messiah, of course, but just one more poor Jew on a Roman cross, that would be just one more poor Jew on a Roman cross. But the execution of the Messiah showed the hollow heart of Rome, Roman law, for example. No wonder Paul says, what price law? But Rome was not just Rome. This is crucially important. It wasn't just Rome. It was Rome as the living example of civilization at its claimed best, at least. Whether Paul would have thought of it as the best or not is another question, but at least as claiming the best to be, better than the Assyrians, Babylonians, Greeks, or anyone else. So that's what raises the whole issue of resurrection for Paul. If God revealed the savage core of civilization by the execution of the Messiah, then resurrection, the cosmic justice of the world, says Paul, has to begin right now. By revealing the savagery of civilization, God also revealed the justice, the cosmic justice of God, not just the individual justice. So as clearly as I can say, that's the heart of Paul. That's the core. this revelation of the mystery. And he is being asked now, he says in that text, to reveal this to the Gentiles, the nations. Sometimes, Jacob, I wish I had never used the term Gentiles in that book. It's too late to do it, but the nations. Now, remember, the nations is a term that includes the Jews. They're a nation too. So Gentiles, immediately means for us Jews, Gentiles. Paul usually talks about Jews and Greeks, but obviously a Jew could be a Greek. They're almost like ideological distinctions or linguistic distinctions or something, but it's to the nations. Let cross out Gentiles, cross out nations, the world.
What did Paul think that God's plan was for the world?
I think, to be honest with you, I can't say much more than just repeat what I've just said. That's the way he sees it. He starts with a problem. Let me try and give an example. It's probably a feeble example, but supposing in our country, Martin Luther King Jr. had been arrested, officially, say, put in prison, put on trial, let's say, for treason, for maybe what he said about Vietnam or something, and was executed. What would that do if you were a supporter of Martin Luther King? You had to choose, obviously, between kind of your country and its justice or your dedication to Martin Luther King. That puts Paul, if you could put it to the power of 10 or 100, that's the position Paul is in. What on earth is going on in this world if God allowed, again, I use strong language, allowed the Messiah to come at the moment when God knew, of course, from Paul, that the Messiah would be crucified publicly, officially, not lynched or run over by a chariot, but publicly, legally, and Rome would approve. What's God up to? And I think the only answer I have is God is up to two things, like two sides of a coin. Can't have a one-sided coin. The execution of Jesus reveals, as I said, the violent heart of civilization. And the resurrection of Jesus, the other side of the coin, reveals the cosmic justice of God. That's Paul's vision. That's Paul's message. And I think it is still a relevant message, whether you're a theist or an atheist. If you're looking at evolution, and whether you're a theist or an atheist, evolution is the way the world is run. I think that's right. Civilization has got us into the mess we're in at the moment. And is there a cosmic justice in the world? Or is it, do we get away with stuff? It seems to me, from an evolutionary point of view, I'm not talking about divine punishment, I'm talking about human consequences. Some bills are coming due to the human race at the moment. So there are consequences. And that would be the relevance of Paul for now. So it not depends, well, if I don't believe in God or the Bible or Jesus or Paul, he has a message like an ancient thinker would, as if you might, if I could use the analogy, you might be reading Plato today to see what Plato had to say to us. He's an ancient thinker.
When Paul tried to convert others into his faith, into his specific view of Jesus, what were his struggles there? And what was he trying to convince them to believe about Jesus?
I think it comes down to a way of life. That's what he would insist on. It comes down to a life. And you could see it, especially now, I'm focusing a little bit on the letters that were written in his name and whose function is to tone him down. Because that famous manifesto in Galatians about neither Jew nor Gentile, male nor female, slave nor free. Just think of that last one, neither slave nor free. Wait a minute. The whole economy It's about the economy, dummy. The whole economy of the Roman Empire is a slave economy. Now, maybe it could be some other way, but that's not the point. It is a slave economy. It's based on slavery, people captured in wars, and even if the wars have toned down a bit now under the Pax Romana, slaves still bear slaves. So it's a slave economy. What does somebody mean by saying there's neither slave nor free? Well, we know what Colossians and Ephesians say about that. It means be nice to your slave. Of course, Christians can have slaves, but the master, speaking of the master, doesn't even mention the mistress, the master should be kind, and the slave should be obedient. That's lovely, but it's a long, long way from neither slave nor free.
And when Paul comes into conflict with someone like Cephas in Galatians, and it's all over the matter of circumcision, so people come to sit down, and then Peter gets away from them because they're not circumcised. Is Paul trying to say that that Jesus has come to loosen up on the Torah? Is he using Jesus to say that circumcision is no longer necessary?
In conflict with James in Galatians, I think honestly, that's too mild a way of putting it. Though it's often put like that, he just wants to loosen up things. That would be like somebody, say, warning today about accelerated climate problems. They're just trying to loosen up things. It's not kind of strong enough. I think what Judaism in the first century, let me leave Jesus and Paul aside, was quite open to conversions. If a male, for example, wanted to convert to become a Jew, he'd have to be circumcised, of course, but he could become a Jew. That was fine. Now, there was also a whole other class, and this is not spoken enough about, called God-fearers or God-worshippers. That would be Gentiles, pagans, if you want to use that term, who've accepted the Jewish God, followed Jewish morality, attended the Jewish synagogue, but if male, they were not circumcised. Now, if they're female, none of this comes up, of course. But male, they would not be circumcised. They're supporters. That was, in a way, a brilliant move. It was sort of conversion by attraction. It didn't bring on maybe the opposition that conversion might bring if a only son in the family converted to Judaism and they couldn't maybe take full participation in the Senate or something like that. So there was lots of options. But Paul's vision is that circumcision, fine for Jews, but a Gentile could be a full member of the people of God without being circumcised. That upped the ante. And as far as we can tell, and I think Luke gets this one right in the Acts of the Apostles, the constituency, the main clientele that Paul is appealing to is not the Gentiles in the forum. We never find them in the forum or the agora, except in Athens. And then he's a dismal failure. They'll laugh at him. He's always in the synagogue, and he's addressing the God worshippers. Now think about that. Think of how explosive that is. He's poaching the God worshippers in the very synagogues themselves. And he's not loosening it up in one sense. He's telling them, you can be full members. Now, if I'm a Jew and I've been circumcised at birth and I hear him, am I hearing him saying, well, that's of no importance to you, you shouldn't have bothered? He's not saying that. I might hear it, but he ain't saying it. What he is saying is, you God worshippers, you God-fearers who attend the synagogue, you can be full members on a par with those born Jews as I am on a par with Peter, for example, full members of the people of God without, if male, being circumcised. That's explosive within Judaism, and it may also be explosive among the God worshippers. So I can see Paul in trouble all over the Roman Empire, because if he was talking in the forum or the agora, talking to, let's call them, people who've never even heard of Judaism, let's say, he's not telling them you don't have to be circumcised. They would probably say, what's circumcision? Never heard of it. Or whoever thought we would? His message is in the synagogue, and he's trying to pick off the God worshippers. And no wonder there's fury all around everywhere Paul goes.
And can you tell us a little bit about the relationship between Ananias and Acts, this person that supposedly taught Paul, one of Paul's teachers?
Let me back up a little bit, Jacob, to the story of Luke and the conversion on the road, because when Luke tells a story, it's impossible to get it out of our mind, out of our visualization. He's so dramatic. And I'm not criticizing him for the theatrics of Paul, being struck down on the road. It's a great metaphor. You're converting from one position to the other, and it happens on the road. The metaphor is powerful. Where else does it happen? But the trouble is that he's blinded by the light. And when you're blinded, you don't see the risen Lord. And Paul repeats again and again, I have seen the Lord, Peter, and that makes me equal to you. I have seen the Lord. He doesn't even recognize the voice. He says, who is that, Lord? What Luke is doing in those three accounts, chapter 9, 22, and 26, three full accounts, is wiping out Paul as an apostle, and therefore, of course, as apostle to the Gentiles. He hasn't seen the Lord, so he's subordinate to Peter. Now, in the first one, of course, if he's blinded, what happens? Where are you going when you're blinded? He's on his way to Jerusalem, to Damascus, to persecute Christians, and he's blinded. Enter Ananias, who takes him by the hand, leads him in there, and baptizes him, and then he sees. Now, by the way, that's a magnificent metaphor for baptism. You're blind before, you're baptized, and you see. It's a lovely metaphor for other Christians. It doesn't work for Paul. So Ananias is a character. Maybe he's real. I have no idea. But he's not needed. He's not needed in Paul's story. Paul's story is of a revelation directly from Jesus to him in a vision.
And where did Paul get certain things from, like, say, the Eucharist, which he attributes to Jesus? Did somebody that knew Jesus, like maybe somebody like James, told him about it, or did he hear it from somebody else? Do you think Jesus actually said that?
Well, I begin going back to what we do know, and I take as exactly factual. He persecuted in Damascus. Now, when you persecute people, you know a fair amount about what they hold. This is an ideological persecution. He is persecuting people who claim, I think, at least Jesus is Messiah. Would he also hear other stuff? Possibly. So let's leave that there. He's not starting off blank. I don't like what you people hold enough to persecute you, and I think he is persecuting them by casting them out of the synagogue. That's what he's after. Now, that doesn't mean just like it might mean today, possibly. If you're dismissed from a church, you could do fine outside it. If you were dismissed from Judaism, you might fall between worlds. You're not really a Gentile, you're not really a Jew. You could be destroyed, even financially. So it's serious business. So I think he did know a fair amount about what they held. That I begin with. Secondly, he says he went to Jerusalem. This is Galatians. He went to Jerusalem and he saw only James, Peter, the the one he kind of condescendingly calls the seeming somebodies. he doesn't even give them, the leaders. He kind of the so-called leaders. Of course, he would have learned stuff. How could he not? Even if he didn't want to, they would have told him. So Paul knew the tradition, and I would even throw the emphasis far more on what he had learned as a persecutor, even than what he might have learned from, say, Peter or James. But I've no problem with that.
What was Paul's view on the relationship between a Christian and a government, like what we see in Romans, where he talks about, like in places like in Romans 13? Is he trying to reconcile, try to tell people to get along with the government so that there's no conflict? What's going on there?
Okay, it's a huge controversy, as you well know, and I've gone backwards and forwards myself on it. Look, if somebody had said to Paul, let me put it hypothetically, in Romans, remember, probably the time he's writing, Nero is in, and maybe there was a lot of discussion about taxation and with a new emperor. But in any case, if somebody said to Paul, should we pay our taxes or not? I'm absolutely certain Paul would say yes. He might add, don't get yourself crucified over taxes. I think that would be his answer. Now, that's not my problem with 13, what we call 13 of Romans, chapter 13. It's this statement that he makes that the archontes, the rulers, are certified by God and have the right, and you must obey them. That the term rulers, archontes, that's the only, comes up twice else, I think, before in Paul, and comes up in that one I quoted already, where he says they would not have crucified if the archontes of the world, the rulers of the world, had known what was going on, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. He mentions it twice. That's not a neutral term for leaders. There's lots of words for leaders. I do this very delicately, Jacob, because people say, well, you just don't like that statement about do whatever the rulers tell you. It's not I don't like it. I think it's kind of stupid. Nobody gives a blank check, or they shouldn't give a blank check to rulers. Not even today. You should at least have your conscience and wonder about it. So, but the more important thing is, I can't imagine Paul writing archontes. Surely you could use some other term. That's his bad term for rulers. I think what happened, and if somebody says, well, you just don't like it, and you're saying this, fine, okay. Let me put it this way. If it comes from Paul, it's the dumbest thing he ever wrote. Okay? I'm suspicious that maybe it came from 1 Peter, because what you find exactly in 1 Peter, the letter attributed to Peter, is exactly that statement, that you should obey the emperor. I think it may well be part of the Peterization of Paul, to use an awful term, of making Paul not only under Peter, but kind of agree with Peter, everything Peter says. I think that whole process is going on maybe even in Romans itself, that some scribe reading this, knowing it, says, well, let me put it wider. It's not just you pay your taxes, you obey your rulers. Tentatively, I would say, I don't think he wrote that. But if you think he did, it's still dumb.
I want to throw something in there real quick. What's interesting is, and I know there's a lot of different opinions about this in scholarship, but in Marcion's version of Romans, it doesn't have that stuff in there about Romans 13.
I'd forgotten that, Jacob.
Yeah. Just want to throw that in there. I just think
Well,
it's
good.
interesting.
Thank
Yeah.
you. That's one thing I should have known. I'd forgotten that completely if I ever knew it. So I'm going to check it out. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, no problem.
That
It's
one
interesting.
section. You meant all of Romans.
At least, yeah, I think, I'm not positive the entire chapter of Romans 13 is missing,
Yeah.
but Romans 13, 1 to 7 is definitely not there. Yeah.
Yeah, because the other argument for it too is that if you take out that section, it reads more or less smoothly from the section before it, which is the end of chapter 12 for us, but of course all of this
Yeah.
is later, into the next section. It's kind of talking about being nonviolent and all the rest of it.
Mm-hmm. We have a super
Now,
chat question. You were saying something, I'm sorry.
no, I was going to ask you, are you certain about 13? It's not 16. I'm getting mixed up now
Yeah,
myself.
it's in Romans 13 where he says, all governments are appointed by God.
And
Uh,
that's missing in Marcion.
that's missing in Marcion. In fact,
Okay.
when you mentioned Romans 16, all of Romans 16 is missing from Marcion. The whole thing.
Okay.
We have a super chat question from iFish Natai. Paul
Okay.
describes Jesus having a heavenly body and not a resurrected corpse. Should Christians embrace the Talpiot tomb instead of despising the thought?
Um, Honestly, I think the Talpiot tomb, and I've been there, is a great story. And it's a useful, what do you call it, teaching moment. Everyone in the Roman Empire took it for granted that when somebody died, they had some type of recognizable human form consistent with who they were. Otherwise, when, say, Aeneas went down to Hades, how could he pick out his father Anchises? Now, if somebody asks us, somebody asked Paul, well, what kind of a body did they have? Well, you could talk about, spectral body, but they took it for granted. Of course they have a body. Otherwise, you couldn't have apparitions. You couldn't have visions. I wouldn't know who the vision was. So that was taken for granted. But I don't take that in any sense literally. It was just part of the presumption of vision and apparition. I I don't think it has anything to do with it. I think if you ask Paul, okay, Paul, now we have found the Talpiot tomb. We have really found the bones of Jesus. There's a big sign there in Aramaic that said, these are the bones of Jesus. Supposing we found it and it was absolutely convincing to everyone this is valid. Would Paul say, could be no resurrection? Paul would probably say, get a life. Get a life. The body molders into dust. The spirit gets its own new body. Of course, I don't think that would bother Paul at all. Because as he says, flesh and blood cannot enter the kingdom of God. Now, it would bother Luke, by the way, because Luke thinks that resurrection is kind of coming back to life and you can have a meal. Paul would be tearing his hair out. Could Jesus just have a meal after? Paul would have said, come on. So, no, I think any of that is interesting stuff, but bad theology.
And in my final question, when did Paul think Jesus was coming back, and where did he get the idea that Jesus was going to come back?
I think the earlier idea that very soon God is going to consummate the world because empires are getting stronger and stronger. Now we have the Roman Empire. Surely, God's going to finally clean up the mess of the world. We call that eschatology or apocalyptic eschatology. It's simply the faith that if God is just and the world is unjust, soon God's going to clean up the mess of the world. And it was an idea at the time of Jesus. Okay, along we come the idea that the Messiah has already come. So we're not waiting for him soon, but he's here already. But the idea of soon lingers on. So the consummation of the Messianic age, it has begun, but it will be consummated soon. Paul thought it would be within his lifetime, or at least within the lifetime of his generation. I think it was part of the dominance, the still dominance of that apocalyptic expectation, which is simply Apocalypse is what happens to a prophet when the prophet loses faith, or at least nerve. That God is operational in the world is the prophetic belief. But where is it? Says the apocalypticist. God's coming soon is the answer. I think it was part of the, you might call the mood of the age. And even though Paul is insisting the Messiah has come, the Messiah has come, the Messiah has come, okay, but it'll be over soon. And he was off by 2,000 years and counting. And when he said soon, he meant soon. He didn't really say soon, he just thought that he would be alive when it happened. He was wrong. Anyone else who said in the first century the consummation will be soon was wrong too.
Before I ask questions specifically about Paul, I'd like to ask you first, what is a Pharisee for those that are not too familiar with who the Pharisees are?
Okay, first thing, clean out your mind about anything you've read in the New Testament about Pharisees. That's that's like reading what you might have about one candidate saying about another during an election. Okay? What's going on is this. This is a kind of a bit of an oversimplification, but I think it's valid. If you looked at the first century under Romanization, the Sadducees were sort of the right wing. They were the collaborators. You don't have to demonize them. They were the collaborators, but they were the right wing. I would say the left wing were the Essenes down at Qumran who've withdrawn from the calendar and the temple of their own people. They've pulled out of the whole thing. They've given up on it. The center is controlled by the Pharisees. They are non-messianic Pharisees. So when along comes somebody like Paul, who is a messianic Pharisee, all heaven breaks loose. So the reason there's so much animosity between Jesus in the New Testament, and I mean Jesus in the New Testament, not necessarily the historical Jesus, and the Pharisees, is they are both fighting for the center. That's what's going on. And usually animosity is worse with those you are closest to within the denomination. It's the heretics you worry about, not the apostates. The apostates are gone. So you have to understand the Pharisees as a major alternative to what you get, say, from a Paul, to begin way back, or a Jesus. They represented an alternative vision for the center. That's for the majority. That's what's going on. So when, for example, Jesus in Matthew 5 says, don't call people names, love your enemies, bless them, pray for them. And then all of a sudden, by chapter 23, he's saying, you brood of vipers and hypocrites, you're going to hell. And there's a whole catalogue of horror. You have to ask who changed their mind. Was it Jesus or was it Matthew? And for me, it was Matthew. Matthew's fighting with his fellow Pharisees. And I think Matthew was a Pharisee, by the way. He's fighting with his fellow Pharisees. And the fighting is nasty. And if we had what they were saying about Matthew, if we had the first century records of what they were saying about Matthew, it would be equally nasty. The only problem is, of course, the New Testament became normative, Christianity became normative, and what we think about the Pharisees became normative. But it's basically historical polemics.
Was Paul a typical Pharisee, or did he differ significantly from the other Pharisees?
Basically, what I've said so far, Jacob, has been negative about them. Let me answer your question by going into the positive. And if you want to know about the Pharisees positively, you don't read the New Testament, you read Josephus. Because Josephus says in his life, his biography, I followed all the precepts of the Pharisees. I think that makes him a Pharisee. So if you want to know about the Pharisees, kind of unbiased, granted Paul is one, read Josephus. And the two big things there are especially their fidelity to tradition, and then ironically, their belief in, now fireworks going off here, the resurrection. Don't presume we know what that means. Before Jesus ever arrived, the Pharisees believed, as part of their faith, not the Sadducees, that there would be a cosmic justice at the end of time. Their problem was that this old idea of Deuteronomic theology, that God punishes and rewards everyone here on earth, just didn't work after the Maccabean martyrs, because the king had killed them if they obeyed God, let them live if they disobeyed God. So the Pharisees said, if there is any cosmic justice in the world, it has to be at the end of time. Everyone's going to rise up, come before the judgment seat of God, not privately, not personally when we die, but publicly. Now, that's an incredible new idea. It's a brand new idea. It's what brands the Pharisees, if you will. And it's a bit ironic to say they're faithful to tradition, because quite frankly, they invented that. Maybe from about 150 years before the time of Jesus, it was accepted there would be a cosmic justice review of the whole human race at the end of time. And by the way, when I say that, if I take it literally, I think it's remarkably silly. Don't believe a word of it. If I take it metaphorically, it sounds like the evening news. We're asking whether the human race can sustain itself. We're asking not about divine punishments, but about human consequences. So when I listen to the Pharisees, and now I get back to Paul in a second, it's resurrection that's the huge new thing that brands them. That's their brand. And that's why they appeal so much to the ordinary people, because the empires have come and gone. The biggest empire they've ever seen, biggest elephant in the room, is the Roman Empire. Well, where's the justice of God? At least the Pharisees are claiming there will be a great review at the end of time. Now, let's turn to Paul. That's Paul. And the point of my book's title, Paul the Pharisee, is he never, ever, ever gave up on that. He didn't give it up. What he did was come up with the astounding idea that this great cosmic justice had begun with Jesus. If I was a fellow Pharisee in the first century, I would say, Paul, you are nuts. The resurrection is a cosmic phenomenon. It's got nothing to do with an individual, no matter how good, holy, or whatever. And Paul's astounding claim, and this, if you want to understand Paul, we have to figure out how on earth he came up with this, is that the great big cosmic justice of the world has begun with Jesus. Put in his own language of 1 Corinthians 15:20, he is the first fruits of them that sleep. Now, that's a metaphor from harvest, as you know. So it's the beginning of the resurrection. Now, he's not claiming, resurrection was some kind of a special privilege for Jesus because he was the Messiah or any of that stuff. That's rubbish. He's saying the general resurrection has begun with Jesus. And to understand Paul as a messianic, or I don't use the word Christian, I'm very careful not to call a Christian, because today a Jew and a Christian are separate religions. Paul is a messianic or a Christic, Christic. I'm coining that word because messianic is simply anglicized Hebrew or Aramaic. Christic is anglicized Greek. So he's a messianic Christic Pharisee. That's the way he pivots from being a non-messianic to being a messianic. He never gives up being a Pharisee. He just becomes, I shouldn't say just, he becomes a messianic one, a Christic one, to the nations, as he says, to the ethne, to the nations.
And how does the book of Acts deal with that? The book of Acts mentions Christians, whereas Paul's letters do not. And so how does Acts reframe Paul's conversion?
Yeah, the first thing we really have to do, if we do it with any integrity, Jacob, is to try and understand how we're going to use Acts. And most scholars will say, "Oh, we give priority to Paul's authentic letters, or we give secondary authority." Yeah. Having said all that, and ushered Luke out the front door, He comes back into the windows, the back door, and every crack in the edifice. They're all seduced by Gallio at Corinth. Oh, Paul appears before Gallio. We know about him. He was there in the early 50s. So we got Paul at Corinth in the 50s. No, that's a classic statement of Luke's exculpation of Christians, using a term now, Christians by Romans. Every single Roman, starting with Paul and Antipas in Jerusalem, every single Roman official who comes up with a Christian says they're innocent. They've done nothing against Roman law. It's all about Jewish stuff. Get them out of here. That's Luke Acts. That's an exculpation of Christians. Luke is writing, and I think I'm just using that name, probably the beginning of the 2nd century. His whole vision is of the ascendancy and priority of Peter over Paul. Now we're kind of beguiled because he spends so much time with Paul, but watch carefully. Major things that happened to Paul in Luke Acts happened to Peter before him. They each, for example, raise a dead person, Peter first. Each defeat a magician, Peter first, Paul second. Also, we have, as everyone knows, the 3 accounts in Acts 9, 22, 26 of Paul's, we call it conversion, from a non-messianic to a messianic Pharisee. First time when it happens, second time Paul tells us. But the same thing happens to Peter. In Acts 10, 11, and 15, Peter is the first one who converts to the Gentiles. Peter! He has that magnificent vision, and he gives the first sermon to the Gentiles, and that's told 3 times. It's told in Acts 10, in Acts 11, in Acts 15. The whole thesis of Luke with regard to Paul is that Paul is blinded. He doesn't see the Lord on that Damascus road. In fact, he doesn't even recognize him. He is to say, "Who are you, Lord?" Paul is not an apostle, and therefore not an apostle to the nations, as far as Luke is concerned. He has glorified Paul by wiping out his apostolicity and his integrity and his authority.
So how does Paul try to wrestle with the different views of the Pharisaic views of resurrection with the views that he has upon Christ?
The best place you can see it, is, for me at least, was in 1 Corinthians, because he starts in 1 Corinthians, the first 3 chapters, about the execution of Jesus. And I'm saying execution rather than crucifixion because we kind of domesticated crucifixion, all those crucifixes everywhere. It's an execution. And then you get to resurrection in 1 Corinthians 15. Let me focus for a moment on those first 3 chapters. Because I think here, Jacob, you can hear, if you listen carefully, the beating heart of Paul. Here's the question in Paul's mind. Now, it's not my question. It's not a question I would ever dream of asking. But I think Paul asks it. And I think it sears his very soul. God, he calls it the mystery of God, the mystery from all eternity, the mystery of divine wisdom. What is it, Paul? From all eternity, Paul is thinking, God knew that when the Messiah came, he would be executed by the greatest empire the world had ever known, that boasted of its law and its peace and its order and its civilization. And they crucified the Messiah. So here's Paul's question. It empowers his vision and fires his mission. Why did God send the Messiah at that moment, knowing what was going to happen from all eternity? Now, honestly, it's not a question I would ever ask. I might ask, how did Jesus fit into human evolution or first century history? But it's never occurred to me to say, because I don't probably um, anthropomorphize God like that and think of God sitting in heaven planning now. Anyway, Paul does. From all eternity, God knew. And Paul's answer is very clear in 1 Corinthians. God, I don't know what verb, honestly. I'm going to say God allowed, God permitted, God decreed, God decided. I know what verb Paul would use. From all eternity, that the Messiah would come and be executed by the Romans to reveal to the nations, the ethne, to reveal to the nations the savage heart of civilization. And as Paul says, none of the rulers, the archontes, none of the rulers got this because, of course, if they did, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. That's Paul's answer. The reason for the execution was so the nations, that's us, would see civilization, of which we're so proud, has a savage core to it. And that's why then, after such a revelation of what humanity is about, you have the counter revelation of the resurrection already starting to show us what God is about, what God's creation is over against humanity's civilization. Now, that's the deepest understanding I have of what makes Paul tick, what really fires his whole revelation. That's how he can justify making the astounding claim the resurrection has begun, because the revelation to the nations, and that's why it has to be to the nations, because it's not the Jews who are going out and killing the Romans. The savage heart of civilization you don't see from watching Judaism in the first century. You get it from watching Romanism in the first century. So that's what I see as the beating heart of Paul. And that's why, for example, he can talk about law and he's not impressed by law. He's seen what law can do. Jesus was legally executed. He wasn't lynched by a mob. He was legally executed according to Roman law. It's not that Pilate was having a bad day. No. So if Jesus was legally executed, then says Paul, what price human law?
So Paul believed that the return of Jesus and the resurrection would occur in his own lifetime.
Yeah, I think so. He was wrong about that, by the way. He was hopelessly wrong about the timing. It's a bit for me like if somebody had said, this is an example I use in the book. If I imagine two rulers, in two countries that were hit by a huge infection, and one ruler said, everyone wears a mask and it'll all be over in 3 months. And the other ruler said, that's silly, nobody wear a mask and it'll be over in a year. Now, let's say they did that and it wasn't over in 3 months. It took a year, but the first rulers lost 1,000 people and the other ruler lost 1,000,000 people. So yeah, one was right about the time, but not about the the remedy, shall we say. So Paul is wrong about the time. He's absurdly off by 2,000 years and counting, at least as of now. If Jesus said the same thing, he was wrong. Anyone in the New Testament, that would take out John of Apocalypse, Mark, the author of Q, most of them thought this is all going to be over in a short while. Now, it sounds to me like, somebody who says to me, I'm going to get a doctorate and it'll be over in 2 years. Okay, 5 years later, they have their doctorate. Okay, I wouldn't go after them and say, it took 5 years. I would say, congratulations, you have your doctorate. So Paul is wrong about time. When he thinks it'll be within his own lifetime, or at least his own generation, he's wrong. Get over it. So was Jesus, if Jesus said the same thing. If Jesus said Mark 9:1, for example, he's wrong. But it's a separate issue when somebody is talking about a a vision and its timing.
What else did Paul think was going to happen during Jesus' supposed return? Did he think that there was going to be some kind of major destructive apocalypse? Does he give any indication of that, or does he have something else in mind?
Yeah, and I really would honestly like here to sort of complain gently because scholarship has spent all its time talking about that, about the end and the vision of the end, because it's so esoteric and everything else. Uh, it's not so esoteric anymore. We're talking about the sustainability of our species every evening on the news. So it's not so esoteric anymore. But as far as I can see, John, excuse me, Paul of Tarsus, in distinction from John of Patmos, does not make the imminence of the end a profoundly causal point. Yeah, he takes it for granted. He takes it for granted. It's going to be over soon. Does he then construct the whole thing like if I was convinced I was going to die tomorrow, I probably won't take out, any long-term job projects or something like that. It would change. I don't see that in Paul. Paul's What fires Paul's mission is we are supposed to be living in the resurrected life. It has begun, says Paul. It's going to end soon. We're in the middle. That's how we should be living. Now, he's wrong in terms of the time, but that's not his main argument. His main argument, when the Corinthians, for example, are arguing that all this bodily resurrection stuff is bunk. We're all good Platonists here. It's all about souls. He never says, you're going to get it when God comes. You just wait. Any day now, you're going to get it. Yeah, that's John of Patmos. It ain't Paul. That's why basically most of the Apocalypse, the last book of the Bible, is irrelevant because it was wrong. Hmm.
And after Paul's death, other Christians writing in Paul's name, how did they try to change what Paul said about the return of Jesus?
Okay. Uh, this touches on one of the things I said kind of in promoting the book, Who's Afraid of the Big Bad Paul? And my answer was most of the New Testament. Paul is the terror of the New Testament. We have 7 letters that he wrote for sure, 6 that came after him, which in various degrees are trying to tone him down, de-radicalize him, re-Romanize him on slavery, on women. And for example, they're trying to show more signs. How do we know when it's coming? Second Thessalonians is asking that same question. And I think if Paul was there and talking to, let me call them the Second Thessalonians, as it were, he would have said, will you get over it? It's about how you live, not how you die. It's why are you so worrying, he would say, about the end when you're not ready to start? So I think the huge transition in the New Testament was it didn't happen soon. Now, how do we get ready for the long haul? How do we get ready for the long haul? And I see that exactly the same today. If somebody said, we'll do this, and that'll solve all our coastal flood problems, it'll be all over in a month. Well, maybe they came up with really good ideas that would take 5 years to really do something. I'm not going to pick them up on the timing. If it was a good procedure, it takes as long as it takes. So Paul, if he was talking, and he is not talking, in the books like the Second Thessalonians, would say to these people, why do you really want to talk about the end when you're not ready to make a beginning? It's like a kid who keeps talking about going to college and he's still talking about it, but he hasn't gone in and registered. It, it I don't know how long it will take, I would say to him, but it will certainly take a long time if you don't get registered and started.
So I'd like to come back to the question of acts.
Okay.
So how does one judge acts? Like when is it most likely telling something true, something historical about Paul? and when it does not?
Well, I tell you how I did it. Basically, I've always been interested in the historical Jesus. I've only been interested in Paul as part of the historical Jesus because he talks about the execution and resurrection, which I think is part of the historical Jesus. And I got interested in Luke primarily because of Paul, because of Jesus, because Luke, using that name in Acts, is talking about Paul. Here's the problem that I see it. Luke, I use that name, has very, very good information about Jesus from Mark, of course, and Q, and very good information about Paul. Very good information. Maybe he even knows the epistles. That's quite possible. He certainly knows Paul's places he's been. He very seldom sends him somewhere he wasn't and mentions most of the places he was. But, Luke is judging all of this from the beginning of the second century, good 50, 60 years after Paul. At the beginning of the second century, Rome, you can read it in Tacitus, has a nice, clear idea who these Christians are. He says it with a sneer on his lips. Well, Tacitus always has a sneer on his lips, but anyway. He says they're the followers of a crucified criminal. And that's good enough. Right there, you got the whole story. He says the disease started over there in Judea and now it's come all the way to Rome where everything rotten arrives eventually. Okay, now, philosophers in the second century are writing apologetical philosophies against the Roman view. Luke comes up with a far, far smarter idea. Let's write a counter narrative. They got a story. I'll write a story. Luke is writing what I'm going to call fictionalized history, not historical fiction, fictionalized history. It's an apologetic. And his theme is, and Paul would turn in his grave screaming, the future is not Jewish Christianity, it's Roman Christianity. When Paul gets to Rome and is teaching unhindered, that's the last word in Greek in the Acts of the Apostles, unhindered, we've arrived. Roman Christianity has arrived. This is the first step towards Constantine, by the way. Luke got it right. The future is Roman Christianity, whether you like it or not. So, how does he do it? Three big themes. Christians don't fight with one another. Don't read Galatians, read Acts 15. Jews cause riots. Any problems are caused by Jews. So, for example, when Paul has to escape from Damascus, it's not as Paul says in 2 Corinthians that the Nabateans are trying to arrest him. No, says Luke, the Jews are trying to kill him. Okay, that's bad history. The third one is, I mentioned, every Roman official says any Christian they meet is innocent. You have Jesus at the end in Jerusalem is exculpated by the centurion beneath the cross. This man is innocent. He's mocked as innocent by Antipas in Jerusalem. And of course, Pilate says 3 times in Luke, mentions 3 times in case you can't count, he's innocent. Same thing's happened to Paul in Jerusalem. The tribune, Lysias, says he's innocent. Festus says he's innocent. The governor Festus says he's innocent. And Agrippa the two. Second, everyone says they're innocent. That's the apologetic pro vita Christiana of Luke. It's apologetics. It uses history. It uses Paul when it's convenient. But the whole theme, repeating, of the Acts is that Peter is much more important than Paul. Paul's the troublemaker. Peter's not the troublemaker. So you have those images eventually of Peter and Paul embracing one another. Why was it necessary to show images of them very early in the first century, embracing one another? And if you look at their arms, you notice that Peter is always embracing Paul. Yeah, they got their arms around one another. But Peter is the one who's doing the acceptance, as it were. So this is the long haul towards Constantine. And it's starting in Luke Acts. And Paul would not like that.
And in my final question, can you tell us about Paul's reconciliation collection? What was his own foundational vision of universalism, and does Acts also reflect on that, or does it try to conflict with that in some way?
Yeah, and that's where all of this kind of comes together, because in Acts 15, there is not a glimpse, a hint of the idea that the mission splits. Now, I'm presuming Galatians is correct. Paul says Barnabas and he, in that order, by the way, Barnabas and he are going to the nations. Peter, James and Peter and John are for the Jews. Now, wait a minute, that's a split in the mission. Maybe you could say it's not a split in the vision, but boy, when you split the mission, you've split the vision. Supposing the Roman Catholic Church today said we'll have women priests for women and men priests for men, and everything will be happy. You can't, you split the mission, you're going to split the vision. Okay, so there's not a hint in Acts 15 of any split whatsoever. Everything is peaceful. Everyone gives a little talk. It's like a little meeting of the Roman Senate. Everyone gives a talk. At the end, James gives the final solution, writes a letter, everything's done. Now, that's not at all what you get from Galatians. There's a split in the mission. And so for Paul, if the mission really splits, maybe tactically for a bit, but he knows if the mission splits, the vision's going to split. And his last desperate and dangerous attempt is to take a collection from the nations, from the provinces, say, of Galatia, Achaia, Macedonia, and what am I missing? Galatia, Achaia, Macedonia. I'm missing something. Achaia. Oh, Asia, of course, Ephesus, Asia. The four big provinces that he does. He takes a collection to bring to Jerusalem as a peace offering, as a reconciliation offering. And I think what happens when he gets there, as best I can reconstruct it, to the smoke screen of Luke Acts, quite frankly, is that he takes it to James, and James says, we'll only take it if you use some or all of it to help something in the temple. I think that's the challenge he gets. And Paul knows at the end of Romans, he says, I'm going to Jerusalem, sorry. He's going himself with the collection. It's not going to work if he just sends it. So it's a collection, as I see it, to James's community known as the poor, capital P. It's not the street poor of Jerusalem. It's James's community of people who are sharing their lives, and he's taking it to James. And James says, no, I'll only take it if you take it to the temple and use it for temple operations. I think Paul does it, and he's accused of taking Gentiles into the temple. He's got them with him, of course, with the collection, and that gives the excuse. He never escapes from Jerusalem, and he ends up all the way to Rome. The reconciliation collection is something Paul risks his life for, knowing, not willingly, but knowingly, as he tells the Romans, pray for me that they will accept the reconciliation collection and that I will escape from the non-believers in Jerusalem. So he's risking his life in the interests of reconciliation.
And I'd like to remind everybody real quick to go get Paul the Pharisee. The affiliate link to purchase the book will be in the description below and in the pinned comment. And with that being said, thank you for joining me today, Dom.
Always a pleasure, Jacob, anytime.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.